Welcome. I'm Phyllis Posner, co-chair of the Lunch and Learn program, along with Nancy Raskin. I'm very excited. We have over 115 people registered. I think we're a little slow in getting it up there, but we're going to have a very big attendance today. It's another amazing turnout. I want to welcome all of you. Looking through the news, I see some new names, so a special welcome to their first-time attendees. We encourage you to stay for the breakout rooms after the presentation is completed. And a special welcome to Hannah Ruth Wellens, who is the new development coordinator at Temple Micah. Welcome to Temple Micah and to Lunch and Learn. As usual, I want to ask all of you to stay muted until we go to the breakout rooms. And if you're not already done so, this is a good time to switch to speaker view. To start today's program, I am pleased to ask Francie Schwartz to present a reading. Francie, thank you for your insight and ingenuity in these presentations, always considering the subject matter of today's program. And I'm going to try and share it. There we go. Go, Francie.
Great. Thank you so much. What I found that I hope you will all enjoy is one of the 100 letters that were sent to the president, the vice president, and members of Congress during the president's first 100 days from theologians of all persuasions from around the country. And this was done through a project called American Values, Religious Voices, which was established by Rabbi Andrea London, who is provost of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, our own religious seminary. And this is by, or was brought to us by Reverend Grace Song, as you see in the bottom, who is active with the Wan Institute of Graduate Studies. So everybody can read along with me as I read this out loud. Let us remember that one thought leads to who we will become. So may we move forward with compassion and embodied wisdom. In the words of the Buddha from the Dhammapada, the thought manifests the word manifests the deed develops into habit, and habit hardens into character. So watch the thought and its way with care, and let them spring forth from love born out of compassion for all beings. As the shadow follows the body, as we think, so we become. Thank you.
Thank you, Francie. Before proceeding with the program, I want to take a few minutes for announcements. The Steering Committee for Lunch and Learn is pleased to announce that Karen Rosenblum and Harriet Weiner have agreed to be the co-chairs of the program starting in July. So this is our last, Nancy's and my last program. Nancy and I want to thank them for agreeing to take on this role and wish them the very best. I also want to give this opportunity to give a big thank you to my co-chair, Nancy. I would not have picked a better co-chair as we were thrown into this virtual format. Our styles and our patience mesh so well. Nancy, thank you for serving with me this past year. Together, Nancy and I would like to thank the committee for their support during the year, especially in the beginning as we worked through the issues of being virtual. Their opinions and willingness to help were so appreciated. Also, we want to thank all of you, the participants, for your loyalty, support, and patience. Our attendance has each month been amazing. We have had some of the largest number of attendees in the history of the program. And your participation in offering suggestions and your involvement in the breakout sessions has been wonderful. I do hope that your participation will continue during the next year as eventually we transition back to in-person sessions. We don't know when exactly this will happen. There are a lot of details the temple is working on, but and we will figure this out, and Karen and Harriet will keep you informed. While I have the floor, I want to ask that anyone who would like to join the steering committee or help with the programs, please let us know. We'll also, as we do go back to going live, we're going to need volunteers again to help with all the things that take to putting together a live meeting. The obligation is not onerous, but your opinions and help would be very appreciated. And everyone, please keep suggesting speakers for the future. It is also very appreciated. Okay, on with the program. I'll shortly be introducing our speaker, Jonathan Weisman. At the end of his presentation, the question and answer period will be moderated by Sid Booth. Please post your questions to the Zoom chat addressed to everybody so Sid can include your queries. At around 1, Nancy will introduce the second half of our program. The group will then divide into random breakout rooms to socialize and discuss today's topic. Jonathan has provided us with some questions to start the discussions. Thank you. The questions will be posted toward the end of the Q&A and will be read aloud before we break out. And about 1:25, we will regroup for short concluding remarks. Now, to the monthly review of Zoom protocol. Please stay muted until we go to the breakout room so we don't interrupt the speaker. As to your video, it's up to you whether you want to be seen or not. Jonathan would like to be able to see you all, so I encourage you to keep the video on so Jonathan knows he has an attentive audience. Finally, please do not use more than one device signed into Lunch and Learn in the same room to prevent interference or feedback. With all the housekeeping out of the way, it's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Weisman, who will be speaking on anti-Semitism after Trump, what we've learned since Semitism was published. Semitism was written in 2018 by Jonathan in the wake of the Pittsburgh Synagogue massacre. In it, he explored how anti-Semitism has always been present in American culture and how the Jewish experience has changed, especially under the past administration. He concluded the book with suggestions on what we should do next. Today, we'll learn more about where we stand today. Jonathan has worked for the past 5 years as an editor of the New York Times, first as congressional editor, and then as Washington domestic policy editor. At the beginning of June, just last week, Jonathan returned to reporting as a senior congressional correspondent. Congratulations on this move, and we look forward to reading your articles again. Over the past 30 years, Jonathan has reported for the Baltimore Sun, USA Today, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. He's also appeared on CNN, MSNBC, NewsHour on PBS, Fox News, Fresh Air with Terry Gross, the Diane Rehm Show, 1A, and On Point. Jonathan has 2 daughters, now both in college, and he is engaged or married, I'm not sure which, to Jennifer Steinhauer, who's also joining us today. Congratulations to you both. With a last reminder to keep muted and to post your questions to everyone in Zoom, I am very pleased to turn the floor over to our distinguished speaker, Jonathan Weisman.
Engaged, because we've been waiting for the end of COVID. So,
okay.
I thank you very much for that introduction. When you go through my work history, it really does bring home the fact that I can't keep a job, but I do move around. And I gave a talk about my book when it came out in 2018. Well, I gave many talks, but I gave one to Micah, and I hope that some of you were at that talk. It was in person. And perhaps some of you even read the book. I don't count on those on such things. But I wanted to talk about what has happened on the subject since publication. So the book, Semitism Being Jewish in the Age of Trump, obviously is somewhat dated because we're no longer in the age of Trump, or some would say we are, but he is always not the president of the United States. And it was inspired because during the 2016 campaign, I and several other Jewish journalists had been targeted by what was known as the alt-right, with just a barrage of hate emails, phone calls, and most of all, attacks, really virulent, ugly attacks, anti-Semitic attacks on social media, Twitter, Facebook, wherever else. And it was the virulence of the attacks, I think, took a lot of people back, certainly me, because we think of anti-Semitism as on the wane in this country. And for 8 years of Barack Obama had lulled us into this notion, into the sense that as President Obama used to always say, the arc of history bends toward justice, and that we were moving toward an inevitably more inclusive, more accepting democratic society. And the last 4 years disabused us of the notion that that arc happens by itself. And in fact, we don't know if we are resuming that arc, or if we are in for a very, very rough ride. When the book came out, I went on a book tour. And sadly, actually, I really had hoped that I wouldn't just be speaking to Jewish audiences, that this book would speak broadly toward the rise of bigotry and intolerance in the country. But generally, by and large, I was speaking at synagogues, Jewish community centers, Jewish audiences. And what I found was disconcerting, because when I would go to liberal synagogues like Micah, reform synagogues in liberal communities, generally my pitch was very well received. And my pitch went like this. Anti-Semitism does exist on the right and on the left, to oversimplify matters. That there is a level of bigotry on the left, meaning more like in the pro-Palestinian anti-Israel movement. No question, and that bigotry tends to hover around collective punishment. That a Jew anywhere in the world can be held responsible for the actions of the Israeli state. This is, of course, bigotry, because if you put yourself into a different position, if you walked up to a woman walking down the street in a hijab and began screaming at this woman and holding her responsible for the Saudi Arabian government's murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, or for the latest Al-Qaeda affront in Afghanistan, that would be considered Islamophobic. Nobody would question that. That was Islamophobic. And that is no different from yelling at a Jew in a kippah about Benjamin Netanyahu's last attack on Gaza. That is collective punishment, is not fair. At the time the book came out, I referred mainly to this kind of bigotry in Europe. I wrote, the renouncing of Israel thus becomes a precondition for tolerance, an insane new development in the ancient European art of anti-Semitic rejectionism. Jews were Christ killers, then moral degenerates, then genetically inferior, and now they're insufficiently progressive. Somehow virulent anti-Israel sentiment has revived the age-old chant, death to Jews, at demonstrations in Paris, London, and Rome. Somehow a column by a Holocaust denier, Kevin Myers, could appear on a Sunday Times of London edition about pay differentials about men and women, which included this brilliant observation. I note that two of the best paid presenters in the BBC, Claudia Winkleman and Vanessa Feltz, with whose no doubt sterling work I'm tragically unacquainted are Jewish. Good for them. Jews are not generally noted for their insistence on selling their talents for the lowest possible price, which is the most useful measure there is of inveterate lost with all hands stupidity. That kind of anti-Semitism always existed, no question, and it existed on the political left. But it was my contention that certainly in the United States, Jews had much more to fear from the political right, because the political right, for all intents and purposes, are well armed. And when my book came out, we had just suffered through actually the predations of the deadly protests of the Unite the Right March in Charlottesville. We had seen that attacks on the internet could metastasize into flesh and blood and deadly attacks from the right. In fact, my book had been completed just before Charlottesville. My family had gone on we were on a trip in Scotland, and I turned on the television at a hotel in Glasgow and saw what was happening in Charlottesville from afar, and then said, I need to pull this book back and write this, because it was really the first manifestation of what we'd mostly been seeing on social media come to life. And once the book came out, I felt completely vindicated for spending most of my time discussing the alt-right and violent bigotry from that side, because after it came out, came the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, came the attack on the Chabad synagogue in Poway, California. And then let's not isolate Jews here. The attack on the mass murder in the Walmart in El Paso, Texas, and the rampage against Muslims in Auckland, Christchurch, New Zealand. These are all of a pace, and they were all following the manifesto of a strange belief that I talk about at length in the book, the idea of white genocide, of replacement theory in its most anodyne form, with the idea that a rising tide of Black and brown people are going to wipe white people off the map, and that this rising tide of Black and brown people is being orchestrated by Jews, the unhidden, the hidden, unseen puppet masters for all things nefarious. That was driving murderous rampages. So when I went on the book tour, I felt like I was on pretty safe ground. Blood was being shed. But what I found was when I went to conservative synagogues, I was attacked roundly, mostly because the people in those synagogues loved Donald Trump. I was told that I was a self-hating Jew in East Hampton. I was told in West Hampton that do I look in the mirror and hate myself for who I am. I was told at one synagogue that the number of right-wing anti-Semites could fill the sanctuary, but the number of left-wing anti-Semites would overwhelm Long Island. And even when I went to a synagogue in Montreal, where Leonard Cohen was bar mitzvahed, and I had an incredibly hostile response to what I was talking about. I went back to my hotel that night and found the most anti-Semitic, virulent, awful, racist email from one of the congregants who had just seen me. And I was really taken aback by how divided the Jewish population was over the question of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism had become partisan. It was in part because of what Donald Trump was doing with anti-Semitism. He was turning a blind eye to the right, the bigotry of his right, of his supporters. but he framed himself as the great defender of Jews. And the defense of Jews he was talking about was the defense of the Israeli government. He was equating defense of Israeli government policy with Jewish, well, with any criticism of Israeli government policy with anti-Semitism. And he had a lot of Jewish leaders on his side on this. And I think that has planted the seeds of what has become a very dangerous partisan divide on what anti-Semitism means. Now, in the last month, I have been on a kind of a soul-searching process on what my role is in the partisan divide over anti-Semitism, because what we have seen since the unrest in Israel, which started on the Temple Mount and in East Jerusalem and spread to towns within Israel proper, and then ultimately to an out war between the Israeli government and Hamas, with both sides wreaking havoc, sending rocketry and bombs into civilian areas indiscriminately. What we've seen in that is, no question, a rise of anti-Semitism from the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel left. It is undeniable. There's no way you can possibly dismiss that the left itself does pose a threat to the Jewish community. The Secure Community Network, which is an organization that advises Jewish communities on security matters, reported just a few weeks ago that there was an 80% spike in anti-Semitic acts during and just after the 11-day campaign against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. There was vandalism in Oregon to Virginia. There was synagogue desecrations in Illinois and Arizona. There were reports of people having bottles thrown at them, children's playgrounds being daubed with swastikas in New York and Tennessee. And of course, I think a lot of you who tuned into cable news or read your paper were aware of the attacks in Los Angeles by a group of pro-Palestinian activists on Jewish-looking people at outdoor restaurants, the physical assaults. And then a young Jewish man who was wearing a kippah on his way to a pro-Israel rally in New York City was beaten severely by pro-Palestinian demonstrators near Times Square. And you know, he has the wounds to prove it. We all saw it. And on social media, in some of these have such echoes of what the far right was doing. There were hashtags like hashtag COVID-1948, which used the founding year of Israel, identifying Israel somehow with COVID-19, a deadly virus. They clearly have nothing to do with each other. That one was actually fomented by Iran. Iran placed that hashtag and then it picked up. Just as Russia in the 2016 campaign was promulgating some of the pro-Trump bigotry and anti-Semitism that would then be picked up by the far right in the United States as their own. They didn't know that it was being pushed by Russian agents, just as I'm sure that many Palestine activists didn't know that Iran was starting mischief of its own on American social media networks. And some of these things really do have echoes of what was happening, has been happening on the alt-right. There was an incident in Britain in which a convoy of 10 pro-Palestinian flag-waving cars drove 200 miles across England to the London neighborhood of Golders Green, which is a Jewish neighborhood, to go beat up Jews. This reminded me of the gunman who drove hundreds of miles across Texas from the Houston area to El Paso to gun down Latinos, saying that Latinos were intentionally coming to the United States to eradicate the white race. Between May 9th and May 24th, Britain's Jewish community recorded 116 anti-Semitic incidents. That was up from 11 over the same period in 2010. These numbers are unavoidable. We cannot put our heads down and say that somehow the anti-Semitism of the far right is of a piece different from the anti-Semitism of the left. And this gets me to thinking, how can we eliminate even this notion of left and right, of bigotry somehow manifesting itself on, I apologize, my dogs are sneezing, of bigotry manifesting themselves from a political perspective. Bigotry is bigotry, right? And we should talk about this, where it all started. And I would say that there was a strange divide on the right between philo-Semitism, this claim of the love of Jews because of the love of Israel, which really started in evangelical circles, and anti-Semitism, which was kind of going on in the same circles. In fact, oddly enough, the anti-Semitism that we were seeing in the early Trump years in Europe, which was driven by anti-Zionism, it was very different from the anti-Semitism we were seeing on the right, which in fact was pro-Zionist. Many on the right really love Israel because they see Israel as an ethnic state, the kind of ethno-state that they want in the United States. They say, hey, if Jews could have their own state in Israel, why can't white people have their own state in portions of the United States? What's wrong with that? In fact, they've used Israel's existence as justification for their racism and bigotry. And no, this brings me to how the Jewish community has been divided on these matters. For instance, under the State Department, under the Trump State Department, the United States government officially adopted a definition of anti-Semitism that actually had been pressed very hard by many elements of the Jewish community in the United States, especially the American Jewish Committee. Now, in that definition, we see some obvious things. Holocaust denial is anti-Semitic. Hatred of Jews, denial of the Holocaust, but also, stereotyping Jews as all-powerful, as owners of the media, that's anti-Semitic. These are obvious cases. And there are pieces of the new government definition of anti-Semitism that, though probably could be argued, I would say are legitimate. Like, for instance, when they say this, when the State Department says, accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or a group, I see that as collective punishment. Holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. That is a bullet point in the State Department's definition of anti-Semitism. And I think, as I said, collectively holding Jews all over the world responsible for the actions of a government, any government, is bigoted, just as holding Muslims responsible for the actions of the Saudi Arabian government or the Taliban would be considered anti-Semitic. But the definition also includes some other things that I would argue against. Some of the other bullet points of our government's definition of anti-Semitism. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is racist and is a racist endeavor. Applying double standards by requiring of it, Israel, a behavior not expected or demanded by any other democratic nation. And finally, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Now, you might find those things absolutely repugnant, calling the actions of Israel akin to the Nazis, or as more is common on the left, calling it akin to the apartheid actions of the South African white-led government of the past. You might think that these are absolutely repugnant, but I would say that those are political views. We have in this country tolerated political views that we find repugnant. Many Americans think the notion of communism, the notion that there should not be ownership of property, that is repugnant. It is anti-American. But we don't make it illegal, and we don't label communist speech as hate speech. We understand that certain speech in this country, certain beliefs are political and protected by our Constitution. So if you believe that Jews are not entitled to their own state on land that was once owned by Palestinians, if you believe that, if you do not believe that, I think as a Jew, I might find that reprehensible. And I might tell you all of the reasons why Israel has a right to exist and must exist because of all the Jews have gone through and because of the Holocaust. I might say that, but I still believe you have a right to have your political opinions. The second one, applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of other democratic nations. I'm amazed that is in our government's definition of anti-Semitism, because you might call it a double standard, but the United States, first of all, gives Israel enormous amounts of aid. And if we are going to give multi-billions of dollars of aid especially to the Israeli military every year, you don't think we have a right to hold it to a certain standard that is higher than we hold to other states that we do not supply with all that money? Why? That is a political view. I don't understand why that was an anti-Semitic view. I mean, in fact, I think we have to remember that Israel itself holds itself to very high standards of democratic values and human rights. So if American Jews hold Israel to the standards that Israel holds itself to in its constitution and in its policies, why is that anti-Semitic? I don't understand. But by putting these things in, we have given Americans in some sense have given permission for the pro-Palestinian cause to feel like that anti-Semitism itself has been politicized, that their political views have been labeled anti-Semitic. So there is a tendency, obviously, to push back and push back too hard. And I think that there are elements in the Palestinian rights community that would look at this and say, if you're going to call me an anti-Semite for my political views, I'm going to take it even further and go into actual anti-Semitism. You've already called me an anti-Semite anyway. Why not? We have to be able to delineate between political speech and hate speech. And even if the political speech that we're discussing is repugnant, it is not the same as hate speech. And I think that we have to wrestle with this. Jews, the pro-Zionist, liberal pro-Zionists, liberal Zionists, and conservative Zionists have to understand that their Zionism is not a religious belief. It is a political belief. Zionism actually was a belief that came well after after Judaism was affixed as a religion, of course. And liberal Jews have to also understand now, it is very important, we have to understand that many of our allies in the human rights community, in the Palestinian rights community, are veering into a dangerous level of anti-Semitism. And we have to be able to call that out. We cannot decide that we are on one side and will turn a blind eye to the other side. Bigotry is bigotry. And I myself am struggling with understanding how to get that message out. And I think that I will be writing about this in the future. I had actually hoped to pursue a book on the growing schism between American Jewry and Israeli Jewry. But I think that what we're going to be talking about more and more is the politicization of anti-Semitism itself. And okay, I've spoken too long, and I'd like to open it up to some questions now.
Thank you. Sid, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, it's on to you.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hello.
We're going to get some questions in the chat, and as those roll in, I'd like to start with a couple of my own. Very personal. With a name like Jonathan Weisman, you are easily identified as a Jewish journalist. Has your sense of apprehension about that changed over the period, say the last half dozen years, or since we moved into the Trump era? And have you had off-the-record conversations with Jewish lawmakers about these issues?
Mm-hmm.
And is there anything you want to share about what they say away from the camera?
Well, on the latter, not really, actually. I haven't. I mean, it's funny. I was talking to Senator Raphael Warnock yesterday, the new African-American senator from Georgia. And we were just talking in the hallway about attacks on him during his campaign for the Senate from conservative Jews like Bernie Marcus, who is one of the co-founders of Home Depot and became an enormous benefactor of Donald Trump. And Bernie Marcus orchestrated a campaign among conservative Jews in Georgia to label Raphael Warnock as an anti-Semite, even though from the pulpit, Raphael Warnock, remember, was the minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was Martin Luther King's church. And my synagogue that I grew up in Georgia, it's called the Temple. And the Temple always had a longstanding alliance with the Ebenezer Baptist Church. And the leading rabbi of the Temple, guy's named Peter Berg, for most of my childhood, the Temple was kind of an urban synagogue, a very liberal urban synagogue in downtown Atlanta. As Atlanta has become richer and more fashionable, the synagogue has become divided between its traditional urban base of liberal Jews and Bernie Marcus and his ilk. Bernie Marcus is now a member of the synagogue, which amazes me. And Peter Berg had this problem where he had members of his own congregation calling his friend, Raphael Warnock, an anti-Semite for having dared criticize Netanyahu's government. And I talked to Senator Warnock yesterday about the difficulty that Peter Berg faced in having one of his synagogue's biggest benefactors calling his friend an anti-Semite, and having most of the synagogue actually standing with Raphael Warnock. Senator Warnock kind of laughed it off and said, Peter's still my friend, and I'll just leave it at that. But in general, to your first question, I am sure that I came to the attention of the alt-right, namely a guy named Andrew Anglin, who was a pro-Nazi editor of a website called the Daily Stormer, it's a neo-Nazi alt-right website. And Andrew Anglin and another of his ilk had kind of devised a way to target journalists by putting these three parentheses around their names. It's called the echoes, and then using actual software to let their followers do Google searches for those names that had been tagged with the three parentheses and go after them. And obviously, I was well aware that my name, it wasn't that I was out proclaiming myself Jewish, but my name gave me away. And my response was not to hide my Judaism. In fact, my response was to speak out and probably to become more Jewish. I actually changed temples from Bethesda Jewish congregation to Micah, and Rabbi Zemel and I have had long conversations about this, about being more public and more outspoken and more Jewish focused.
Okay, looking to the chat, Phyllis asks, as the pro-Palestinian people are becoming active in their attacks, are the far-right activists taking advantage of this and joining in or increasing their activity at the same time?
I would say that the far right activists, that ironically, the far right has used the attacks on Jews to advance a lot of their political views, and their political views being anti-Muslim, bigoted against. You've heard people like Tucker Carlson in the wake of these anti-Semitic attacks, speaking out loud about this notion of white replacement theory. White replacement theory used to be the stuff of the very fringe on the internet, and now they speak about it on Fox News in prime time. So I think that what I have not detected a pickup in specifically anti-Semitic talk, but remember, a pickup in bigotry, in bigoted talk, like white replacement theory, like white genocide, will always redound negatively to Jews, because there are many many on the far right who see white replacement as organized by Jews, and that's why the gunman who attacked the synagogue in Pittsburgh said he can't hold back anymore. He can't let the Jews do what they're doing to us. And what they are doing to us, white people, was sending in Muslims and Latinos and Black people to dilute their power and their presence. And certainly, I mean, I think that some of the impulses toward voter suppression that's going on right now, you could attribute to the rising bigotry.
Alan asks, how about anti-Semitism resulting from demonizing Israel, double standards regarding Israel, and delegitimizing Israel? Sharansky's 3Ds.
Well, I mean, Sharansky and Natan Sharansky and I could have a very long argument about what is a political discussion and what is a bigoted discussion. I mean, the fact is, as I said, I think that, I've heard people say, how come Palestinian rights activists or the left holds Israel to a standard that they don't hold Syria to? And I always say, really? Do you really want the Israeli government to be compared to the Syrian government? I mean, I think this notion of double standard could be applied, to anything. I mean, why don't we let Americans, the American government abuse human rights? Because, hey, there's human rights abuses everywhere. I mean, I think Israel should be held to the standard that Israel holds itself to. And Israel believes itself to be an ecumenical democracy. That's what it is. And as I said also, if the United States is going to give billions of dollars in aid to Israel, especially the Israeli military, it has a right to request something in return. We require human rights virtually all of our donor of our recipient nations. That I do not believe that that's a double standard. I believe that it's just called no free lunch. I think that the delegitimizing of Israel can be dangerous. Because the problem is that people will take political views and extend them to bigoted views. So you can, if somebody hears, I don't believe that the Jews deserve their own state. I believe in what's called the one state solution, a democratic Palestine where Jews and Arabs are created equally. That's a political view. But some people might take that the next step and say, Jews are a colonial power that should be, sent into the sea. Obviously, when you start talking about violent retribution in politics, then you've moved to bigotry. But again, to say if you say I don't believe in it, I don't believe in the Zionist entity. I mean, some of our most famous liberal Zionists have begun questioning the notion of Zionism as a political end. But I would not call them anti-Semites. They're Jews. So I think that this is all very obviously a very heated debate and a very legitimate debate. But I don't think that the notion, even a repugnant notion of which is political, is not necessarily bigotry.
Elizabeth Eby asks or says, I think a kippah and headscarf are religious symbols. Flags are political.
Mm-hmm.
I have great difficulty with flags in synagogues. Does the confusion of politics and religion create or support bigotry?
Elizabeth, that's a really interesting question, because I really haven't thought about that at all. I mean, the fact is that you go into a synagogue and you see an American flag and an Israeli flag. And obviously in some circles, that conjures up the notion of Jewish dual loyalty. And Jewish dual loyalty is an old anti-Semitic canard. But I'm always reluctant to respond to anti-Semitism by taking down the trappings that provoke it, right? I mean, so just because somebody sees dual loyalty in the fact that there's an Israeli flag in the synagogue, does that mean, well, we should take it down? I'm afraid that by taking it down, we're almost legitimizing the view. So I would say it's good food for thought. At this point, I'm not going to tell Rabbi Zemel to take down the Israeli flag from the Micah halls.
Leslie asks, and maybe you can parse this. It's a very brief question. Can you talk more about getting the message out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I when I was on my book tour, I was asked this question all the time. What should we do? What do we do? And one of my responses has always been, look, if a Jew shouts anti-Semitism, or if an African American shouts racism, or if a Latino shouts, that there's anti-immigrant fervor, or if a Muslim shouts Islamophobia, there tends to be two responses. One response is, you think you've got it bad, we've got it worse. Or the other response is, well, you Jews, are you blacks, are you Muslims, are you Latinos, are you homosexuals? You just love to draw attention to yourselves. And I said, to counter that, what we need to do is build a larger anti-bigotry movement that links arms with all of the groups that feel right now embattled. That was always my pitch during this, and there are and Micah is part of this. There are efforts to bring Jews and Muslims and immigrants and African Americans together to have to create this kind of anti-bigotry movement. But one of the things that I've become increasingly enmeshed in thoughts and about is how Jews and Palestinian rights groups can find some kind of common ground. I would never expect, like, for instance, the Anti-Defamation League. The Anti-Defamation League is always running into trouble because it's an anti-bigotry organization founded as an to fight anti-Semitism, but it is expanded out to be against all forms of bigotry. Its problem is that when it goes out, it is forever confronted by the left on its pro-Zionism, that it believes in an Israeli state. And I actually spoke with Jonathan Weisman, the head of the ADL, about this. And I said, look, I would never ask that the Anti-Defamation League give up its belief in a Jewish homeland in Israel. I never say that. But maybe what you need to do is make an affirmative effort to link arms with Palestinians on human rights, that at least we Jews can speak out in favor of and in tandem with Palestinians about the treatment of human beings in Israel and on the West Bank and in Gaza, to try to say, look, we can't all agree on the fate of Israel as a nation. We just can't. But at least we understand that the people who live in this region need to be treated with dignity and respect, and we will all stand together on that.
We've become, in my opinion, a much ruder society, and it's hard to pin that on any one element. The anonymity of social media. Onward here. Karen Rosenbaum asks, does the US hold Saudi Arabia to the highest standards in exchange for their military aid?
No, but Saudi Arabia has a lot more oil than Israel. We make a lot of, the United States makes a lot of adjustments. But I'll tell you, look, there's a bill in Congress. It was introduced by a woman named Betty McCollum, a congresswoman from Minneapolis. And the bill says that Israeli military aid should at least be predicated on the treatment, on better treatment toward children on the West Bank. Children. She's trying to find the lowest common denominator, what we can all agree on. And when she first introduced her bill, she got hardly any support. But as the House moves toward the left, as younger voices emerge, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, her bill has gotten more and more and more co-sponsors. And I would argue that that is the least that we owe it to Israel. We owe it to Israel to begin making demands, because there is no blank check, and again, we can always phrase it as, let's hold you as a country up to the standards of your constitution and your laws. And I don't believe that the Israelis would say, sure, no, we don't want to. We want to treat Palestinian children terribly. No, they don't want to. So
we have maybe this will be our last question. It comes from Francie Schwartz's name, but I have an idea it's her husband, Stu. As a journalist for more than 40 years who happened to be Jewish, I never experienced any personal anti-Semitic incidents from either colleagues or viewers of news programs I produced. But I often had to defend the media against charges that it was generally anti-Israel and took a more pro-Arab position. Have you experienced any of this?
So you're talking to somebody who works at the New York Times. We deal with it all the time. I mean, our coverage of the Gaza war was we were very out there. The New York Times was very out there in our coverage. Remember, we did a front page story naming every child that was killed in Gaza. And we are still right now being accused of anti-Semitism and a pro-Palestinian view. No matter what. I remember it was at one point the New York Times had a prohibition on sending any Jewish reporter to cover Israel because we would be accused of slanting the news one way or the other. Tom Friedman is the one who broke that rule. But that doesn't mean that Tom Friedman wasn't accused of being an anti-Semite. He was. And we are constantly being accused. And I'm interested, Stu, that you said that you never suffered any personal anti-Semitism, because the fact is I had never suffered any personal anti-Semitism either. That's why what happened in 2016 and 2017 to me personally was such a shock, because it seemed to me it came absolutely out of nowhere. I'd never seen it and I'd been a journalist for decades. So yeah, things are changing.
All right. I think Jonathan has put some very interesting questions in the chat, and I'll let Phyllis pick it up from here.
Oh, not Phyllis, Nancy.
Oh, Nancy, yes.
Thank you, Sid. That's all right. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think we could have gone on further with this. So we'll have to have you back, Jonathan. Well, let me begin with by just saying thank you to Sid, as always, for being our excellent moderator. You always ask just the right questions to spur other questions of our speaker. And Jonathan, that really was an excellent presentation. You've provided us an important but chilling analysis of the rise of anti-Semitism during the Trump presidency and heightened now with the recent Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What you wrote about in Semitism in 2018 is even more relevant, I think, today. As you said, we must be vigilant and we must speak out against any bigotry or hatred here in the United States, whether it's directed to Jews, Asians, African Americans, or minority groups in other countries like the Rohingya people in Myanmar. Jonathan, we're very appreciative of your taking the time from your busy schedule to share your expertise on such a critical topic for the Jewish community. And though we remain muted, I know that all the participants join me in a rousing round of applause to thank you for today's presentation. That's the disadvantage of being virtual. So, and thank you to Jonathan for providing those 4 questions to get us started when we go into the breakout rooms in a short while. They've been posted in chat, but just let me read them to you right now. Examine your presuppositions. During the Trump years, did you feel that anti-Semitism of the right or anti-Semitism of the left was more of a threat? How did that change after Charlottesville, then Pittsburgh and Poway? How has your view of the threat of anti-Semitism shifted since the latest Israeli-Hamas war and the attacks on Jews in New York and Los Angeles? In opposition to the actions of the government of Israel, excuse me, I'm saying it wrong, is opposition to the actions of the government of Israel anti-Semitic? How about opposition to the existence of a Jewish state on the eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean? When does a political opinion become hateful or hate speech? If I told you I was a communist, would you say I did not have the right to espouse my belief in communism because you find the ideology repugnant? Or would you say political opinion must be tolerated? How is that similar to or different from someone saying he or she does not believe Jews have a right to a homeland on land once largely populated by Arab Palestinians? Why is it not a political opinion repugnant, though you may think it is? So that's a lot of food for thought, and I know we will have some really interesting discussions. As always, I want to express our appreciation to David, Francie, Sid, Jerry, Barbara, Harriet Weiner, and the entire Lunch and Learn Committee for all the work they do and the support they have given to Phyllis and me. I also want to thank Rachel Gross, who stepped in this month as Zoom host in place of David Diskin, who is away. Rachel, we're sorry that you will be leaving the temple after the high holidays, but we wish you well in your new endeavors. And there's one other person at Temple, Micah, who has been incredibly helpful to Phyllis and myself this year, and that's Janelle Disa. Thank you, Janelle, for producing our monthly flyers and for always being there for us. Thanks too to everyone who has sent in suggestions for speakers and subjects to consider for future programs, which leads me to telling you about next month's program. On Wednesday, July 14th, Dr. Helen Burstein and her husband, Mark Blumenthal, will give a talk on Frank Burstein's story. Who knows what tomorrow will bring? The program will be a multimedia presentation on the life of Helen's father, Frank Burstein, and his experiences during and after the Holocaust, including 5 years of slave labor that took him to Auschwitz, a death march, and liberation at a camp of Mauthausen. Please register by Monday, July 12th. We cannot ensure that you will get the Zoom link if you register later.